I mean, I've always taken the view, I've campaigned against the European Union, I campaigned in favour of Brexit as a trade unionist and as a socialist. Not because I thought that Brexit was going to create some sort of land of milk and honey immediately that we left the EU. The reality is, when we come out of the EU, we're still going to have a Tory government that spent 8 years imposing austerity, imposing a tax on working people, and I don't expect any of that particularly to change immediately post-Brexit. But for me, Brexit was always about clearing the path. It was about clearing the path so that at some point a radical reforming Labour government could come along and could deliver the sort of manifesto that we would want to see any Labour government deliver. And for me, it's always been one of the talking points of British politics, why the left and why the trade union movement went from being fiercely anti-EU to almost now defending it at all costs. And when you consider that the EU is an explicitly anti-socialist institution, the EU has got privatisation and neoliberalism written into its treaties. There are huge problems in terms of the right of any member state government to take industries back into public ownership. Member states that might want to give state aid to industries that are in trouble. You only have to look at the Stability and Growth Pact, which limits member states' governments from running a budget deficit of more than 3% of GDP, effectively outlawing the theories of Maynard Keynes inside the European Union. So it's always been a mystery to me why any organisation on the left and why any trade union would want to throw its lot in with an institution that had that at the core of its agenda. And I think also there are very real questions over whether the Labour manifesto of last year at the general election could even have been implemented, frankly, whilst we were a member of the EU. So I think we do need to think big. I think we do need to think about what a radical reforming Labour government could do free of those restrictions from the EU in terms of being able to properly invest in industry and public services and take industries back into public ownership and restore manufacturing, etc. And it just seems to me there's certainly been over the last couple of years a striking lack of vision on the part of leaders of the Labour movement. These are people, and I sort of argue with fellow trade union officials long into the night sometimes. These are people who, in a heartbeat, would support any other group of workers in any other part of the world who were throwing off undemocratic or corporate power. But when it comes to workers in their own backyard in Britain, they suddenly say, no, British workers can't be trusted. British workers would be lambs to the slaughter of a Tory government, and their faith in workers suddenly disappears. And to see trade union leaders, as we've done recently, pray in aid, the words of chief executives of multinational companies and Airbus and people like that, and to use their arguments as a reason for not leaving the EU, or at least for not leaving the EU without a deal. These are people who we in the trade union movement would normally never invoke in terms of their arguments and to deploy them. But suddenly when it comes to Brexit, trade union leaders seem only too happy to do that. And I think what we need to do, and I've said it for the last 2 years, we need to look at Brexit as what it was. It was a genuine democratic revolt in this country. It was a revolt by people who felt that the political establishment in this country had completely stopped listening to them. And they were suddenly handed a weapon that they realised they may never get again, and it was a weapon that if they used, they would be able to make their political masters for the first time sit up and take notice of them, and they deployed that weapon. And I think that when workers come back and challenge the establishment as they did in that way, it's something that the trade union and labour movement ought to embrace. And one of the disappointing things, I think, is that in the 2 years since the referendum, we've heard a lot, almost exclusively from the Westminster Commentariat. We hear all about the dry technical arguments about the single market and the customs union and the Irish border. And of course all of that stuff is important, only a fool would say that it isn't. But actually it's not the reason why 17 million people voted leave. the reason why so many people voted Leave was because of it was about different things. It was about democracy, it was about self-government, it was about values, it was about community, it was about identity, all of the things that the political class in this country have stopped talking about and still are not talking about, despite the fact that so many people voted for it. And from a Labour Party perspective, I mean, the debate that's gone on in the last few days, I think, has been really disturbing in many respects. And you only have to do the number crunching and to look at the data. 70% of Labour constituencies voted Leave. 59% of people who identify as working class voted Leave. That number goes up when you look at some of those post-industrial heartlands, the traditional Labour areas, you know, the small towns, which once upon a time had core Labour support, but increasingly now are less attracted to the Labour Party. The 64 target seats that Labour needs to win in order to win power contains many high concentrations of Leave voters, and we can't ignore that. And for me, the idea that the Labour Party, which I have to say is becoming, if you look at the data in terms of the membership, 77% of members, I think, fall into the ABC1 category, essentially the middle class category. I think as a strategy, the idea that an increasingly middle class party should tell millions of working class voters that they got it wrong and that we should do it all over again would be electoral suicide. And that's the message that we need to keep sending to the people at the top of the party. And I think we do need to be careful about language as well. I mean, I don't like the term Leavers and Remainers anymore. You know, the Leavers and Remainers, frankly, haven't existed for 2 years. What we've got, I think, in the political debate at the moment are Democrats and anti-Democrats, and I think the Labour Party needs to be seen to be on the side of Democrats. So, and I'll conclude with this, I think we do, you know, we have to recognise there are divisions out there, and I think as a Labour movement it is crucial for us not to exacerbate those divisions, but to try to bring people together, to try to create that common good between the working class, the middle class, between Leave voters and Remain voters. That's crucial, and we don't want, you know, some sort of civil war in the movement or in wider society. But for me, it has to be, any coming together has to be predicated on the acceptance that a referendum was held, a result was given, and we ought to respect the outcome of that vote. So from my point of view, we need to get on with Brexit, we need to implement it, we need to do it without further delay, and at the same time, we need to fight for a Labour government. Thanks very much.